Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, but more specifically, we are going to talk about Bitcoin dominance. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. Now, before we get too far into the dominance videos, I always like to remind people, repetitive as it may be, why Bitcoin dominance is important, okay? Because if we cannot establish the importance of tracking it, then it's going to constantly make people think that it's not something worthwhile to track in the first place. So the reason why, for me, Bitcoin dominance is quite frankly, for me, the key to unlocking the secrets of the Cryptoverse is because it tells you if the lowest risk cryptocurrency is outperforming the collective altcoin market or not. Remember, if you're an investor in crypto and you're putting your money into something, you want to make sure that the higher risk things that you're putting your money into are at least occasionally outperforming the lower risk things. But if the Bitcoin dominance is in an uptrend, then it generally means that Bitcoin is outperforming the collective altcoin market. Now, one major caveat, and I have to address this right off the bat, there are a lot of altcoins that outperform Bitcoin, even when Bitcoin dominance is in an uptrend. There are a lot. And I even said many times, there's always going to be some that outperform Bitcoin. That's how it's always been. That's probably how it will always be. There's always going to be some that outperform Bitcoin, even in a Bitcoin dominance uptrend. But oftentimes, the altcoins that are outperforming Bitcoin are changing. So like one that was outperforming last year might not be outperforming this year. And one that was outperforming this year probably wasn't outperforming last year. And we'll talk about a few examples of those. But the thing that has stayed true for the entire last couple of years or so is that Bitcoin dominance has been generally going up, okay? And again, the reason why I think it's important is because as an investor in crypto, if I think Bitcoin dominance is going up, then I elect to have my own portfolio be Bitcoin heavy as opposed to altcoin heavy. So for instance, I converted most of my altcoins back to Bitcoin in Q1 of 2022. I converted my Ethereum, a lot of my ETH, to Bitcoin in the months before the merge and leading into the merge. So I did that because of my view that Bitcoin dominance was going to go higher. And while there have been some altcoins that have done very well, and I congratulate anyone who's made money on them. I'm not trying to minimize that. I'm not trying to take that away from you. I'm just trying to establish my viewpoint on the market, why I have elected to keep my Bitcoin, or to keep my crypto portfolio Bitcoin heavy for the last 2 years, and what would make me change my mind, okay? So the first thing we'll look at here is just the Bitcoin dominance chart. And if you look at it, you'll see that, the last 3 weeks, we saw the Bitcoin dominance march back to the downside. But in this current week, in this recent week, we completely wiped out all of those losses in a single week. What's really interesting is if you take a look at where we held the bull market support band on the weekly time frame back in January of 2023, it was at 41%. And then you fast forward basically a year later, we're holding support at it at 51%. Now remember, Bitcoin dominance occasionally checks in with the bull market support band, right? It'll go back down to it. It'll hold it as support. It's done that many times. And in fact, you can see that it tested it several times over the last year. There was a test here at 41%. We also tested the 21-week EMA at 43%. And then we tested it again right here at around 48%. So, and then we sort of rode that bull market support band for several months before ultimately, blasting off from it once again. So you can see we've held support at it a number of times. And without a doubt, every single time we have gotten one of these pullbacks, every single time, everyone has thought that it was about to go down a lot and crater to 30% or 20%. If you think back to a lot of the views that people have expressed throughout YouTube and crypto Twitter, most of them have been bearish on Bitcoin dominance for the last 2 years, constantly calling for alt season and constantly calling for Bitcoin to lose market share because they think that this time is different, right? And this has been ongoing for a long time. And what has happened is essentially exactly the opposite, right? Dominance continues to go up despite their proclamations that it won't. Furthermore, a lot of the altcoins that are up are mostly only up because Bitcoin has lifted them up, right? So while people who were bearish on Bitcoin dominance, they maybe were bullish on altcoins, but the only reason many of those altcoins went up is because Bitcoin took them higher, right? So Bitcoin dominance has gone up, meaning altcoins have gone up because Bitcoin has gone up, and it is not the other way around, right? It is not the other way around. And so, yes, altcoins can go up on their USD pairs if Bitcoin goes up, but the problem, in most cases, always some exceptions, but in most cases, the problem is that Bitcoin has outperformed most everything else over the last couple of years. Yes, go ahead and list all the ones that I'm not referring to in the comments. There's always some, right? I'm not trying to say there are not any, but the trend has been clear for a long time that dominance was in a macro uptrend. And I do think that, that we are nearing the time where we could see sort of, these final moves on Bitcoin dominance take place in early, maybe the first half of 2024, and then perhaps the trend will start to change. But this has been my view. I think that this view has been correct for a long time, despite a lot of people not thinking that it's correct. Okay, so one of the things that I think is relevant to also think about here are a lot of the shorter term timeframes, because if you look at like the daily time frame on Bitcoin dominance, let me get this to a normal scale. If you look at the daily time frame on Bitcoin dominance, there's this trend line that I know a lot of people have looked at, but many were celebrating when it fell below, but you can in fact see that Bitcoin dominance has gone back above it, arguably making this just a fake out, and so I know you could even try to look at this on even shorter time frames and make the case that it's potentially just back testing, but as far as I can tell, it's broken these trend lines and it's going higher. That's my view, right? That's my view. So what we're going to do is we're going to make the case as to, how high could it ultimately go. We're going to talk about some of the altcoins that have outperformed at various stages. We're going to talk about, the general trends, and I'm just going to leave you also with maybe a couple of counterpoints that would throw at least a question mark in my view on the market. I think it's important to sort of look closely at our own views and say, yeah, like I've been correct on Bitcoin dominance for a while, but that doesn't mean I'll continue to be correct on it. Like it could change at some point. And so we're going to talk about a lot of that sort of stuff. Okay, so Bitcoin dominance is now at between 53 and 54%. My view for a long time, and I've been very vocal about this since well over here. My view has been that dominance is likely trending towards around 60%. Now, that seemed crazy when it was back at 38, 39%. Doesn't seem that crazy now, right? I mean, it's back to 53, 54%. It's not really that far away. A couple of different reasons for that view. One of which is if you were to look at this fib retracement tool, we've talked about this a few times, but this is just one view of the market. I would argue that this tool is not the reason I'm bullish on Bitcoin dominance. This hasn't been the reason at all that I've been bullish on it. But if you look at the breakdown point from last cycle and you see where dominance went, it rallied all the way back up to the 618. And then if you go back and look at it this cycle after the breakdown point, you can see that in fact the 618 would correspond to 60%. So that's one view that I think supports the idea that dominance will continue to go up. That is a weak view. It's a weak view. The technical, the TA stuff on using fib retracement for me is not a very strong view. It's not. And this has never been the reason why I'm bullish on Bitcoin dominance. This view has been able to convince some people over the last couple of years that it was going higher when previously they didn't think it would. But this is not the reason I have been bullish on Bitcoin dominance. It never was. It never will be. The reason I was bullish on Bitcoin dominance is because I believe we are in a late cycle environment, a late business cycle environment, where as QT, as quantitative tightening continues, and as interest rates stay higher for longer, higher risk assets bleed to lower risk assets. And the reason for that, if you think fundamentally, if you think about like the stock market, the reason why lower market cap stocks bleed to higher market cap stocks is because, think about it practically. If you're a company like Apple, do you think they can survive 5.5% interest rates? Of course, right? Of course. Apple's not going anywhere anytime soon. Yes, their stock price could fall, but I don't think any of us think that we're going to be unable to buy an iPad or an iPhone next year because the Fed kept rates too high for too long, right? None of us think that. None of us think that Apple won't survive. If Apple doesn't survive, that's, we're going to have other things to worry about. I think a lot of us could agree that a company like Apple is going to survive whatever's coming. Even though it could take a big hit, doesn't mean it's not going to survive. Companies like Google will survive. Alphabet. Companies like Meta and Microsoft and all the other main companies that you can think of, so the quote unquote blue chip companies that you can think of, yes, they can take a hit when the economy is bad. And yes, on their USD valuations, they can go down. But guess what? People are going to be less worried about those companies surviving than the microcaps. Because the issue is that while we think companies like Apple and Alphabet and Microsoft, while we think those will likely survive in the end, no matter what really the Fed does, can we really say the same about microcap stocks that don't have a healthy cash balance? Can we say that about the Russell 2000 when many of those companies could go bankrupt if the Fed does not cut rates quickly enough? If you were to take a look at, say, the Russell 2000 divided by the S&P 500, what you'll notice is that it has been in a downtrend for quite a long period of time, in fact, right? Quite a long period of time. But this move here, this big move by the Russell against the S&P, did not occur until after the Fed reached their last rate cut. Let's overlay US interest rates onto the chart and you'll see what I mean. So you see this move right here by the Russell, this huge outperformance against the S&P that lasted for about a year. That did not happen until the Fed massively cut rates. But you can see that before that, the Russell was bleeding from 2018, from mid-2018, if you think back to mid-2018, until March of 2020. Yes, it had some pretty nice bounces, but it did not actually bottom. The Russell did not bottom against the S&P until we went back to looser monetary policy. And the reason is because at that point, once the Fed goes back to, basically zero, 25 basis point interest rates, whatever, effective 0%, when they go back to that, whatever companies have survived, well, monetary policy from that point is only going to get easier in the short term. So if they haven't declared bankruptcy and they've survived all the hard times, then now that looser monetary policy has arrived, guess what? That's when they start to outperform the S&P 500, right? That's when the Russell starts to even outperform Apple, right? During a period after the Fed cuts rates, right? And you can see here, it wasn't even immediate, right? I mean, Apple still outperformed, but eventually they got a pretty nice move against Apple. Now, the macro trend has still been down because Apple is a blue chip and the Russell 2000 is full of a lot of companies that eventually just go bankrupt. But you can see where these larger outperformances come from the Russell against a company like Apple can often be during periods of monetary policy that would sort of support the idea that, hey, looser monetary policy has arrived. There's nothing to be worried about right now, and these microcaps can start to outperform. Right? So we've mentioned that many times, but the grand scheme, a lot of these companies just bleed against the blue chips, even though there's sort of counter trend moves in the short term. Why are we talking about Apple? This video is on Bitcoin dominance. Well, it's the same thing. It's the same idea. It's if you're going to hold a cryptocurrency during a late cycle environment, a late business cycle environment, what are you going to hold? Are you going to hold Bitcoin that has stood the test of time for the last decade? And that even if it does go down on its USD pair, even if there is a recession, even if there is a deflationary spiral, whatever, and even if Bitcoin takes a big hit, you probably still think it eventually will recover. The problem is that you cannot make the same case for every altcoin. The problem is that a lot of those altcoins during late business cycle environments, they just go bankrupt. The developers move on to something else. And why shouldn't they, right? They already pre-minted, or they pre-mined a lot of tokens. They probably dumped them on you guys while your favorite influencers were shilling them to you. And then instead of continuing to develop that project, they just go develop something else where they mint a ton of more coins, right? And then they just get people to hype that project up. The problem is that a late business cycle environment is not very conducive for the dominance of microcaps against the dominance of blue chips. And that is why I have been fundamentally bullish on the Bitcoin dominance for all of 2022 and all of 2023. Because I looked at the market cycle, looked at the business cycle, and said, look, guys, we're going into a late business cycle environment. And until the Fed starts to cut, the dominance of Bitcoin is likely going to go up. I don't really care what direction Bitcoin USD goes, whether it goes up or down. It's mostly gone up. But the point is that whether it goes up or down, Bitcoin dominance should go up until we get back to looser monetary policy. Have we gone back to looser monetary policy yet? No, we have not. Look at interest rates compared to Bitcoin dominance. Have we gone back to looser monetary policy? No. When did Bitcoin dominance top last cycle? After the Fed started cutting rates, not before. There's a lot of people on Twitter that have spent the last 2 years calling the top on Bitcoin dominance. And every single time it goes higher, every single time, they then say that's the top. I never ever saw them post anything bullish about it, but they're sure as hell going to tell you when the top's here. Every single time. It's not a popular view to be bullish on Bitcoin dominance. It's really not. I mean, honestly, next business cycle, I don't even know if I'm going to even talk about it because of how much hate comes with it. But it's not been wrong. The view has not been wrong despite what people want to say. Despite the people on Twitter, the people that make YouTube videos about these views, whatever. These views have not been wrong. They have been correct. And you can see very, very clearly that Bitcoin dominance last cycle did not top until after rate cuts arrived. And why should they? Because until rate cuts arrive, how do you know that the microcap you're out there buying, because someone on Reddit told you about it, how do you know it's going to be even here in a year? How do you know those developers they're not going to just move on to a new project in a year? You don't know that. But a lot of us would say, look, in 5 years, if you were to pull up CoinMarketCap, what do you think you'll see? I think most people would say Bitcoin will be there. Most people would probably say Ethereum will be there too. Beyond those two, you're going to get a lot of mixed results. Now, if you're watching this, you're probably like, well, my altcoin is the best thing ever. It'll be there. The problem is that there's millions of other people that think the same thing as you, but for a different altcoin, right? So maybe you're really bullish on altcoin A and you think it's got the best fundamentals ever, but for every person like you that thinks that, there's a lot of people that think this altcoin's better, or that altcoin, or this altcoin. And at the end of the day, the altcoins that are in the top 10, they constantly change. But Bitcoin has stood the test of time. Now, why after rate cuts would Bitcoin dominance top? Fundamentally. Well, it makes sense, right? It makes sense. If we were to actually go back to looser monetary policy, if we were to actually go back to it, which we probably will sometime this year, if we were to actually go back to looser monetary policy, that means that the altcoins that are still around, that have still, they're still kicking, then it gives some confidence to those altcoins. Because it says, look, they just survived the tightest rate hiking cycle, or the quickest rate hiking cycle in history during QT, where the Fed was reducing the size of their balance sheet. And if they can survive that, then why when the Fed goes back to lower rates, would they not outperform against the blue chip? That's the reason why dominance tops, is because the people that, and I'm not talking about you, because a lot of people that might be watching this video have probably been buying altcoins for the last 2 years, and but I'm just saying, like, in general, that is the reason, is because the people look at the market and they say, looser monetary policy means higher risk stuff has a chance to outperform the lower risk stuff. For the last 2 years, a lot of the higher risk stuff hasn't really had a compelling chance to outperform Bitcoin. Yes, some have outperformed. Congrats. Collective altcoin market is not. So that's why I've been bullish on Bitcoin dominance for so long. And if you look, you'll see that Bitcoin dominance had 3 red weeks in a row. Why was that? Well, one reason could be that the market was getting a little bit ahead of itself and starting to price in a lot of rate cuts. Right? The market was starting to price in a lot of rate cuts, which again, I think there will be rate cuts in 2024. That's my base case, is that we get rate cuts this year. The problem is that until they actually arrive, monetary policy hasn't really changed. And there's still a question mark as to when we're actually going to get that first rate cut. Furthermore, there's the question of when the first rate cut comes, is it sufficient to move the needle? One of the things you'll notice is that after Bitcoin dominance topped, it's not like altcoin USD pairs bottomed, right? It's not like immediately altcoins started to go on a massive bull run. No, they went down. They just went down commensurate with Bitcoin, right? So after this move right here, if you were to overlay Bitcoin USD, after Bitcoin dominance topped, if I can overlay this right here, so you can see Bitcoin USD topped right here in July or June. It was like late June, early July. Bitcoin dominance topped a couple of months after that. Now, Bitcoin dominance topped after the first rate cut. Bitcoin USD topped before the first rate cut. You see? Bitcoin topped against the US dollar before rate cuts arrived. Bitcoin dominance topped after rate cuts arrived. Why is that? Why would lowering interest rates be bad for an asset like Bitcoin? Well, here's the issue. This is the issue that I see, is that if you have inflation at 3-4%, which is still well above the Fed's goal, you have it there. And if you have a Fed that's willing to cut rates even when inflation is not back at their target, that tells you something. It tells you that maybe the economy is slowing down. So maybe the reason they're cutting rates, maybe, and again, I know, just bear with me, right? And I know this might come as a surprise, but maybe the reason they're cutting rates is not because they want to help your altcoin portfolio. Maybe they're cutting rates because the labor market is softening up. The problem, though, is that a 25 basis point rate cut is going to do absolutely nothing for the labor market. Do you think there's anyone out there that's running like a retail shop that, at 5.5%, their business is slowing down, but the minute that the Fed goes to 5.25 or 5%, that's going to move the needle? They're not going to go out and hire a ton of people just because the Fed cuts 25 to 50 basis points. That's going to do nothing. It's not going to make a difference, right? And the type of investor that is more risk averse, they're still going to be happy with maybe 4 to 5% risk free. The only way you're going to get the more risk averse type of person to go invest into risk assets like the stock market and whatnot is to make it so that the risk free rate is a lot lower. If the risk free rate's only 2 to 3% and inflation's running at 2 to 3%, then it's almost like you feel compelled to invest more money into risk assets, this just so you can get a return, right? Just so you can get a return. There's actually a chart that I can show to sort of illustrate that. Let me show you guys this chart because and again, this is really, I don't know why I'm showing this, but look at the retail money market funds. You see all the money that's poured into money market funds? When do they go down? When do money market funds go back down? Right? When we go back to looser monetary policy, because then the risk-free rate isn't so great, and you go back and buy the risk assets that that took a hit because of it. So yes, in the short term, rate cuts are often not a good thing, and the reason they're not a good thing is because it's an admission by the Federal Reserve that says, hey guys, the economy looks pretty weak. And then the investor response is to say, there is no way they could be cutting right now with inflation where it is. And the only reason they're cutting is because the economy looks really, really bad. Look at, we were just talking about this in the video recently, the different, we looked at the employment. I think we looked at the employment one. Let me see if I can find that one, because that one was an interesting one. Let's see, it was the services employment, I believe. ISM, it was the ISM. Look at this chart. So the United States ISM services employment. There's a lot of different labor market data that doesn't look that bad. Initial claims look great. Continued claims are a little bit elevated. Unemployment rate still relatively low. Counterpoint is it's often low before it goes up. Look at ISM services employment. It's cratering right now. It's lower than it ever was during the dot-com crash. During dot-com, it never even went to the 43.3 level. Is this a fluke or is it real? If it's real, it means the Fed's going to be cutting soon. It means that these cuts are probably coming, if that's a real data point. And honestly, if that's a real data point, this is not enough rate cuts to move the needle. So when we think about Bitcoin dominance and the reason why it tops out after rate cuts arrive. That's what I would think fundamentally. It would top out after rate cuts arrive, because then the higher risk stuff can start to compete with the lower risk stuff. But Bitcoin USD last cycle topped before the first rate cut. It's pretty clear. So Bitcoin USD tops first, rate cuts happen, then Bitcoin dominance tops. The problem is that after Bitcoin dominance tops, that doesn't mean that altcoins start to just go up. They then, if you were to overlay total 3 onto this chart, after rate cuts arrive, total 3 can still go down because Bitcoin goes down, right? So yes, dominance might be going down, but Bitcoin's going down, therefore altcoins are going down. So you reach a point where like altcoins can bottom against Bitcoin collectively, but just because they bottom against Bitcoin doesn't mean that they're not going to go any lower on their USD pairs. So that's the issue, and that's why it's such a hard market cycle, is because things are bottoming against other ratios all the time, right? All the time. So let's take a look at a few examples. So Ether Bitcoin. If you guys have been watching these Bitcoin dominance videos for the last 2 years, there shouldn't be a single one of you that is not glued to this chart, at least on a weekly basis, right? This chart honestly might be one of the most important charts in cryptocurrency to watch. Ether, Bitcoin. Why is that? Is it because, you think I'm a maxi? Because I'm not. You can call me a maxi. Doesn't make me one. Ethereum is a blue chip. It's a blue chip, right? And if you're a Bitcoin maxi and you don't like the fact that I'm saying that, too bad. I don't really care, right? Ethereum is a blue chip, just like Bitcoin. That is my view. But Ethereum has been bleeding against Bitcoin for a long time. And the problem is that, just like Bitcoin dominance, everyone has been calling on this ratio to bottom for the last 2 years. How many people have been bearish on it? Like, I've been posting bearish content on Ether Bitcoin for 2 years. Most people have not. They just keep saying, oh, it's bottomed here, or it's bottomed here, or it's bottomed here, right? They just keep saying, oh, well, it's holding up well, right? It's holding up well, and it just keeps going down. So I'm not saying it can't bounce. That's what it does a lot of times. In fact, a lot of times I make a video at some point in the next few days or few weeks, there's a bounce, and everyone's like, oh, well, it's bounced, therefore the theory's wrong. And you just wait another few months and it just rolls over to a new low, right? So yes, there's a lot of people that keep calling the bottom on Ether Bitcoin, but they were never bearish on it. They were calling for the flippening at the merge. They were calling for it to flip Bitcoin at the merge, which, by the way, marked the top. Not even the cycle top, but it marked the lower high. This is an important chart. Why is that? It's because the Ether Bitcoin valuation marked a very important milestone last cycle for Ether USD. And I'll show you what it was. This is Ether Bitcoin at 0.049 last cycle. In June of 2022. This looks oddly familiar to this right here. Doesn't it? Looks really familiar. Looks really, really similar, in fact. I think a lot of people haven't wanted to believe it. You got a peak. You got a peak. Then you got your lower high. You got your lower high. In between your first high and your lower high, you get a capitulation down, just like that. And then after the lower high, you spend a long time watching the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation bleed all the way back down. If you were to look in December of 2017, when the first wick came on Ether Bitcoin, to how long it took to break below it, 83 weeks. 83 weeks from this low here to when Ether Bitcoin broke down. Where are we now if we look at this wick? We're about to start week 82. Week 82. Who cares, you might say. So what? So what if Ether breaks down? So what if it breaks down in its Bitcoin pair? Why does that matter? Why does it matter? It all goes back to this idea that Bitcoin rallies and Bitcoin dominance uptrends, they serve a purpose. They break all Bitcoin pairs down so that when Bitcoin rolls over and it goes lower on its USD pair, which most people can't imagine happening right now because we haven't had a large correction in a long time for Bitcoin, then that altcoin has nowhere to hide. If you were to look at days since a certain percentage decline for Bitcoin, the last time we had a 30% drop was 418 days ago. 424 days ago. The highest it's ever gone is 430. I'm not saying it can't go longer, but it just goes to show why people think it can never correct 30% again. It's been over a year since Bitcoin had a 30% correction. Over a year. There was not a single 30% correction in 2023. So Bitcoin rallies break alt Bitcoin pairs down so that when Bitcoin USD rolls over, the altcoin has nowhere to hide. A fascinating chart to look at is to overlay ETH USD with ETH Bitcoin. And, this chart is, I don't know why I deleted that. It's very interesting because when you look at what ETH USD did last cycle, it was also putting in higher lows. It broke up and then it broke down. What marked the top for Ether? What marked the top? Right here. Right there. Ether USD topped when ETH Bitcoin broke down. ETH USD topped when ETH Bitcoin finally broke. And when it broke, ETH USD then trended down for several months, right? Now look today. You see the same, a very, very similar thing, right? ETH USD has been putting in higher lows. And arguably it's doing a very similar thing, although it's not as volatile as it was over here, right? So you could argue that we've sort of we're slightly above that level, just like we were over here, which also, by the way, occurred right before Ether Bitcoin broke down. So then Ether Bitcoin broke down, ETH USD had its final move. Everyone was euphoric as Bitcoin soared to what level? To 14K. Bitcoin soared to 14K. Which, by the way, 14K was an interesting level. Why is that? Because, well, if you look at the fib retracement, 14K was just above the 618. Just above it. So where would that be today? So it depends on what peak you take. If you take the first peak, the 618 is at 48, a little over 48,000, about 48.5K or so. Counterpoint, if you take this from the first peak, we already hit the 618. So it kind of depends on you know, which one you're measuring it from. But again, I mean, this is what happened last cycle. I'm not here to say that it has to play out the same way, but I mean, you know, there have been some elements that have, right? Like Ether Bitcoin has fallen down, and every step of the way that it's fallen down, people just keep saying it's holding up well. The problem is that once it finally breaks, what if that marks the top on ETH USD, and then ETH USD starts to fall? Now, what you'll see last time is that once Ether Bitcoin broke down, it bottomed about 2 months later. 2 months later. Where would that put it now? Well, it would mean if it were to play out in the same way, let's say it breaks down, you know, within the next couple of weeks or so. If it were to break down in the next couple of weeks, then 2 months after that puts you in about March. Potentially. For a bottom on ETH Bitcoin. I don't know if that's going. I mean, we're going to have to play it by ear. I mean, I don't know how it's going to play out, but that's what it would look like if it emulated the last cycle. What's interesting about March? Why is March fascinating? Is it fascinating because it's 2 months after it would have broken down last cycle? Maybe it's fascinating because that is, in fact, coincidentally, where the market thinks the Fed's going to start cutting rates. What did we say before? All Bitcoin pairs collectively bottom after the Fed cuts rates. That means Bitcoin dominance tops after the Fed cuts, maybe just after. ETH Bitcoin bottoms just after the Fed cuts, or around that time. And what happens if ETH Bitcoin, if the Fed is cutting in March of 2024? If the Fed's cutting in March of 2024, then maybe that means that ETH Bitcoin is finally entering that bottoming process, just like it did over here. So perhaps that's what we need to look at on the Ether Bitcoin pair over the next few months, is if it were to break down here, does it go down into this range, this 0.03 to 0.04 range, which I've been saying forever, and then from there try to start to work its way back up. A fascinating way to look at ETH Bitcoin is not to just look at the higher lows that everyone loves to point out. You know, everyone always says, well, you have this low, and you have this low, and you have this low, so why can't it be a higher low? It probably will be a higher low. I'm not calling for a lower low on ETH Bitcoin. I'm not. That would be surprising to me. If ETH Bitcoin took out this low down here, that would be very, very bearish, and that is not what I'm calling for at all. A lot of people love to point out the higher lows. Not a lot of people like to point out the lower highs. If Ether Bitcoin if the Ether Bitcoin valuation is so bullish, why has it not put in a new high since 2017? You know, I mean, I don't know about you guys, but it's been 7 years, right? At what point, I mean, if a decade goes by and it hasn't put on a new high, are we just going to keep saying, well, just you guys wait, it's going to eventually? A decade's a long time. You know, like my kid would have gone, goes from basically being 0 to 10 years old. Think about that. Like, think about a kid going from 0 to 10 years old. That's the amount of time it could be before people start to finally think like, oh, what happens if the trend has changed? But the point that I'm trying to make is that both views are relevant. It's relevant to say, look, these are lower highs. It's also relevant to say, well, it's also higher lows as well. Perhaps the way to look at it is to say that what if it's on some type of logarithmic regression curve? Like this, where it's sort of slowly going to whatever the fair value is. Maybe the fair value of Ether Bitcoin is going to be found somewhere in here as it goes asymptotically to that valuation. But in the meantime, perhaps it has to drop back down to this level and make sure there are buyers there, that make sure that there's people willing to take the risk on ETH over Bitcoin. Everyone keeps telling me that you make more money with Ethereum than Bitcoin. Yeah, when? Yeah, when the Fed goes back to lower rates, maybe, and they go back to QE, maybe. But ETH Bitcoin is down 30% since here, maybe even a little bit more. 43% down. People who have been in Bitcoin the last couple of years are up a lot more than the people that were in ETH, right? A lot more. 42% down. Since the merge, since when everyone was calling for the flippening, it's down 40%. So, I mean, I look at the chart and I say, it's not like I'm saying it has to break down, but what if it does? And there's a lot of people that don't have a plan if it does. They basically just say, well, it's going to stop here and it's not going to go back up. What if it does get a bounce, right? I mean, it's always possible it gets a bounce. If it does, I would look towards the bull market support band first. That's currently at around 0.056. So if it bounces here, that's what you look at. Look at the 20-month moving average on ETH Bitcoin. This is an interesting moving average because this is the moving average from when it broke down last time. The Ether Bitcoin valuation was basically in a downtrend after this broke. It did not break back above the 20-month until 24 months later, 2 years later. This broke down here. It's only been a year. It could be 12 more months before ETH Bitcoin breaks back above the 20-month moving average. The 20-month moving average is at 0.06474 right now. So again, that's what I'm looking at. And I'm saying, look, guys, if Ether Bitcoin breaks down, where does Bitcoin dominance go? Where does it go? It goes up. If Ether Bitcoin breaks down, Bitcoin dominance more than likely goes up. And it looks like it potentially could be in the process of breaking down. Could it grind it out a little bit longer? Sure, right? And if ETH Bitcoin gets a bounce in the next week, I'm sure Twitter will have a field day with it. They've had a field day with it for the last 2 years, and every time they dunk on the view of ETH Bitcoin going down, every time they dunk on it, they then disappear when it fades and puts in a lower low, only to come back on the next bounce. And Bitcoin dominance just keeps going higher. And what once was seen as low on Bitcoin dominance when it had a massive pullback to 43%, then it was seen as low when it had a pullback to 47, then a massive pullback to 49, and then now most recently down back to 50 to 51. But it just keeps on going up. And it's probably going to keep on going up until we get back to looser monetary policy. Take a look at ADA Bitcoin. Look at this chart. This is an interesting chart. Really, I think it's fascinating, honestly, because it's almost identical, in fact. Almost identical. You can see the same exact pattern is potentially playing out, where you get a low, and then you get a lower low. And I'm going to overlay US interest rates onto this chart because, again, it tells a fairly compelling story. So you get a low on ADA Bitcoin. You then get a lower low. You then pop back up to your last hurrah. This was in April of 2019, 3 months before rate cuts arrived. 3 months. Where did this, you get your low and then a lower low. And then it popped up. Where did it top? In December. 3 months before rate cuts arrived last cycle. What's 3 months after December? January, February, March. January, February, March. Rate cuts. Rate cuts. ADA Bitcoin broke down. So if it were to play out the same way, the expectation would be that ADA Bitcoin sort of falls back in, down to 800 to 900 sats, and then people hope that it holds. Maybe they call for an inverse head and shoulders or something like that. I don't know. But then what happens if it just breaks like it did last cycle? Now, last cycle, when ADA Bitcoin broke, it broke on a Bitcoin USD rally, right? You can see right here. This was the low on ADA Bitcoin. It broke down on a Bitcoin rally. Is the same thing going to happen, right? Is ADA Bitcoin going to break down on a Bitcoin rally just like it did last cycle? Right before the first rate cut arrived? It's possible. It's certainly possible that there's look, the narrative is there, right? You have the spot ETF. There's the halving, right, in April. The narrative is there that, for why it could break down. And you still have tight monetary policy. We have not gone back to looser monetary policy just yet. So what if everyone who celebrates that this is the bottom on ADA Bitcoin, just like they did over here, what if they've celebrated prematurely and they got excited about the same type of move that occurred last cycle at nearly the same valuation and at nearly the same lead time before the first rate cut? Now, I know what you're thinking. You're saying, well, why don't you talk about altcoins that have outperformed Bitcoin? Look, ADA Bitcoin has outperformed over the last few months, right? So like if you traded into ADA at 800 sats and it went up to 1600 sats, that's a 2x move, right? Congrats if you made money on that. But guess what? This was a nice move over here too, and this one was another nice move. And this was another nice move. We had no shortage of good moves by the ADA Bitcoin valuation, but they still have resulted in the downtrend ultimately continuing given enough time. AVAX Bitcoin is a great example of another coin that has done really, really well this, the last couple of months, right? It went up almost 300%, and that's great. And honestly, I hope it survives. I really do. I hope Avalanche, I hope Cardano. I mean, I hope these altcoins survive long term. I have nothing against them. The problem is that a lot of the ones that are outperforming this year did not outperform last year, and the ones that outperformed last year are doing mostly nothing this year. AVAX did not do much of anything last year. This year got a 300% rally. But look at Matic Bitcoin. Matic Bitcoin, what has it done this year? Basically nothing. But last year, in 2022, it got its 300% rally, right? So you can see the altcoins that are generally getting 200 to 300% rallies this year against Bitcoin, or at least the last couple of months, differ from a lot of the ones that rallied last year. So collectively, we've seen money go from this altcoin to that altcoin, and yeah, like Matic USD has not done really that great. It's not been keeping up, right? ADA USD had a nice move here, but so what? It didn't do anything last year. A lot of the coins that made moves last year aren't doing a damn thing this year. But what is this? What did go up last year? What did go up last year and this year? Or, sorry, 2022 and late 2022 through all of 2023, Bitcoin dominance. Throughout all of it, dominance just keeps on going up. Just keeps on slowly going higher despite people calling the top. Now, a really fascinating chart is to look at this one. This is total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin. Look at the move. You remember the move we just showed on ADA Bitcoin? Is this not the same move that we're seeing right here on total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin? Look at this. A low at around 41%, a rally up to just above 50%. Same thing, right? What if it's the same thing? What if all Bitcoin pairs are breaking down as rate cuts arrive? Here's the fascinating way to think about rate cuts. Don't think about rate cuts as the reason why your altcoin bottoms against the US dollar, because it's likely, rate cuts often mean risk assets go down, especially if it's a recession. If it's not a recession, then it could be different, right? Or, last cycle in 2019, it's not like we had a recession. That didn't arrive until 2020 with a pandemic, right? But think about rate cuts as not telling you if assets have bottomed against the US dollar. Think about them telling you if the asset is now bottoming against a lower risk asset within the same asset class. Rate cuts show you when the altcoin bottoms against Bitcoin. Altcoins bottom against Bitcoin after rate cuts arrive, not before. That's what history shows. So when rate cuts arrive, I'm not going to be on the lookout for alt USD valuations. I'm going to be on the lookout for alt Bitcoin valuations, because that is where they tend to bottom, is shortly after rate cuts arrive. Now look at this. Alt Bitcoin pairs collapsed into the first few rate cuts. What if the same thing is happening here? What if the same thing is happening? If you pull up the bull market support band for this chart, it's from 45 to 46%. We're currently at 44%. Let's see where the weekly close comes in. Right? You'll see where the weekly close comes in. Look at total 2 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin. It's the same chart, right? It's the same thing. It just includes Ethereum. And you can see that it also had a nice move, but it did too last cycle, right? Look at this. Last cycle, this metric had a nice move and topped out 3 months before rate cuts arrived. Where is this top? This is in December, January, February, March 2024. What if it just collapses like it did last time? Look at right here, April 2019 until September. It took 19 weeks to find the low. Now remember, even though it did, that's not where alt Bitcoin pairs bottomed. They still had a couple of, another few weeks before they finally threw in the towel. They didn't throw in the towel until Bitcoin did. And again, you still have the spot ETF hype, right? You still need to break Ether Bitcoin off support. That hasn't happened yet. So yes, if Bitcoin were to rally into the spot ETF, it could lift up Ethereum. It could lift up Cardano or Avalanche or Polkadot. It could lift those up on their USD valuations, but there's a good chance they're bleeding on their Bitcoin valuations. And then, as they finally stop the bleeding against Bitcoin, the only reason they stop is because then Bitcoin is dropping, and because those altcoins have already been bled dry for so long, they're going to drop with Bitcoin if Bitcoin drops, but they don't tend to drop too much more than Bitcoin does, if they're not going to be a relic from a prior cycle. A lot of people have told me that instead of looking at total 3, I should look at others. Let's look at others divided by Bitcoin. This is another great way to look at the market. This is not, this is only looking at, I think, outside of the top 10. Look at others divided by Bitcoin. Has it had a nice rally? Yeah, it has. It also had a nice rally over here. When did others divided by Bitcoin top? April of 2019. 3 months before rate cuts arrived. 3 months before rate cuts arrived. When did it potentially top here? December. 3 months later, January, February, March. Where could things throw a wrench in this? Well, what happens if the first rate cut doesn't come till May? Maybe, there's always a chance that Ether Bitcoin gets a bounce in the short term, and we have to wait another month or two, and then maybe Bitcoin finally breaks it off support in March before the halving, and then we take it from there. You need to think about other scenarios, because that's one potential scenario where Ether Bitcoin doesn't break down in the short term, and it still has a few more weeks before it does. Of course, the more bullish view is that it doesn't break down, and I understand why people think that it might not. I suppose that the main arguments, of course, are, well, it's deflationary and the tokenomics are different. Well, guys, it's been like that since the merge, and ETH Bitcoin has just bled the entire time, right? So I don't know if we should put a lot of weight into that. The other thing to remember, think about it like this: look at the channel. Look at this channel right here. Okay, so connect these highs to the lows. Extend it out. What do you see? I'll tell you what I see. I see this. I see a peak and a peak there, and another peak right there, and one that came pretty close right there. I see a move down to this level here, not to the bottom of the channel, but to somewhere in between, and then a rally back up to the midpoint, just over around that midpoint. And after it reached that midpoint, around 3 months before rate cuts arrived, that's when it collapsed to the bottom of the channel, right here. And then we tag that again right here. What if others divided by Bitcoin is around this area right here, where the next move is for it to go to the bottom of the channel? Again, that doesn't mean their USD valuations have to immediately collapse if Bitcoin goes up. If Bitcoin goes up, it'll take altcoins with it. If Bitcoin goes down, it'll take altcoins with it. The point is that if you believe in the dominance theory, is that it doesn't matter the way Bitcoin goes. Dominance is going to go up either way. So if you want exposure to the Cryptoverse, Bitcoin gives you that exposure. It gives you exposure to the potential upside in case we stay risk on, but it also minimizes your downside risk in case we roll over into a bear market or a recession or anything like that. I think this is the important way to look. I think it's an important way to look at the market. I get a lot of people don't like it. And imagine if Bitcoin were to hold altcoins up for another couple of months. People are not going to believe that they could go lower on their Bitcoin pairs. And look, guys, I could eat these words. It's possible that I'm wrong. It really is. I get a ton of things wrong. I feel very convicted about this position because it has been playing out. I could be wrong. And just because I was right about Bitcoin dominance over the last year and a half, 2 years, whatever, doesn't mean I'm going to keep being right about it, right? There's going to come a time where dominance is going to top out. And some people believe that already happened. And they could be right. These are just my views, right? These are just my views. One counterpoint to dominance topping out is that oftentimes, if you look at halving years, 2016 and 2020, dominance doesn't tend to go that much higher. This is dominance without stablecoins. Look at 2024, though. It's already shooting up. So is this time different? Is Bitcoin dominance more dependent on monetary policy than it is just where we are in a potential cycle? Well, so far, you can see the last two cycles when the year got started, dominance barely went up and then it just collapsed. Now it's moving up pretty strong, in a pretty strong way. Remember, ETH Bitcoin normally goes down in the second half of the bear market year, 2022, but it didn't this time, potentially because of the merge. Normally, ETH Bitcoin does well in January. Perhaps it's not this time because of the spot ETF narrative. Look at ETH Bitcoin monthly returns. It's currently down in January. Just like it went up in late 2022, when it normally doesn't. You can see 2018 was mostly red. 2022, there was a decent amount of green months in there. Perhaps now it's paying the price for that, as now instead of the merge narrative, you have all these Bitcoin narratives. Think about it. There's been no shortage of Bitcoin narratives. You've had everything this past year, and it's sort of reaching a crescendo with the spot ETF and the halving. What if Bitcoin dominance tops out in the first half? Maybe it tops out later on, but what happens if it tops out in the first half of the year and it just does so after all these narratives are like, everyone just flocks to Bitcoin. There's spot ETF, there's halving, there's all these institutions, there's countries. And then just when it seems like altcoins can never go up against Bitcoin again, that's where they bottom. But they bottom not because of the narratives, but because the Fed is finally going back to looser monetary policy. So those are my views on the market. And they're not popular. They're really not. And I've definitely lost a lot of sleep, dealing with a lot of people that are very strongly against these views. But I have to go back to the chart and say, look, it has not been wrong to be bullish on Bitcoin dominance. It has not been wrong. It has been going up for a long time. If you don't think that it's been going up long enough because you say, well, it bottomed here in September 2022, if you exclude stablecoins, it's been going up since May of 2021. That might come to as news to some people, but since May of 2021, excluding stables, dominance has been going up. This was a pretty big drop right here. It's moved back up. It's mostly wiped away that loss. We'll see what it does over the next couple of weeks, especially going into the spot ETF and over the next few months going into the halving. Does it finally break Ether Bitcoin down? And if it breaks Ether Bitcoin down, does that correspond to a local high for Ether USD just like it did last cycle? By the way, remember guys, it didn't just mark the top for ETH USD last cycle. When Ether Bitcoin broke down last cycle, it also marked the local top for Bitcoin. You see? Ether Bitcoin broke below this wick right here. Right? So you can see this going all the way across. That right there, right where it broke down, that's where Bitcoin USD went in sort of that final topping process. So let me pull it up on this chart. Because that one's not, it seems like it's loading. So let me just pull up Ether Bitcoin. Right here. Right there. When Ether Bitcoin broke down, it marked the local high for Bitcoin. Ethereum is king of the altcoins, basically. So when it breaks, if it does, if Ether Bitcoin breaks, then that could be the green light to tell Bitcoin that if it wants to drop against the US dollar, it can crush Ethereum. Because Ethereum will have nowhere to hide if it goes below 0.049. I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up there. Those are my views on Bitcoin dominance. I know it's been a pretty long journey for those who have been following the dominance view. I know it's been stressful, but it hasn't been wrong. Dominance keeps on going up, and there could be another move or two in it to invalidate it. If Ether Bitcoin doesn't break down this quarter, like if it just doesn't break down, then perhaps you could come up with reasons why it's different. But so far, seems like it's playing out in a similar manner. Alt Bitcoin pairs getting pretty iffy just as rate cuts arrive, and I just know from the last cycle it was not fun when that happened, where all those altcoins finally broke down on their Bitcoin pairs, and then we truly found, the extent to which they had to go before they found, ultimately found their bottom. If Ether Bitcoin breaks, I would be looking towards that 0.03 to 0.04 range for a potential low. And I think that's mostly what I will be sort of focusing on, if it were to break down, is to try to nail the low, or at least get close to it on the Ether Bitcoin pair. But in the meantime, let's see if Bitcoin dominance can take out this high, because there's a lot of people that are putting a lot of confidence in this being the top for dominance, and I'm just wanting to know, like, well, what happens if it's not, And by the way, there's also one more way to look at the market, and that's the blue chip dominance, Bitcoin dominance plus Ethereum dominance. Look at this. Just before rate cuts arrived, Bitcoin dominance plus ETH dominance went all the way up to 73% and then collapsed to 67. Same exact thing just happened. It went up to 73, collapsed down to 67, and now it's starting to go back up. And again, overlaying interest rates onto this same chart, you can see that Ether dominance plus Bitcoin dominance did not top until after rate cuts arrived. So that's where I stand on the market. I think that the Bitcoin dominance is still very much bullish until proven otherwise, and it hasn't been proven otherwise just yet. Thank you guys for tuning in. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe, give the video a thumbs up. And again, we do have the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.